I'm so excited about organic no-till systems. I think because there's so much interest right now, it feels like everybody is talking about it. And so I think it's really interesting to bring try to bring some of the knowledge of, I think, what's out there, as well as some of the trials that I think Cole and I have been working on, and bring some of those results to folks. And I also think there's a really interesting moment right now where there's work that's been done a little bit more on the tractor scale, which is really kind of my area of expertise, and then Cole's experience with hand scale no-till, and thinking about how different these systems are, but how they can both really speak to opportunities to move forward. So I think our hope, Cole and I, my hope today is to, again, go through slides fairly quickly, to give some context, maybe have a little bit of time for us to have some back and forth, but then really to have a big chunk of time for discussion, I think, with you all. So that will be our goal. Again, I imagine Cole and I will probably go over, but we're going to do our best to keep it tight. I will say, for folks that did join the pre-conference at EcoFarm on reduced till and organic systems, my presentation is very similar to that. So apologies if folks are getting a review of that. This will be a much more condensed version. But again, I do hope that Cole will add some kind of extra insights. So in terms of my talk, I think I always have to take the opportunity, I think, because there's so much interest in organic no-till, to really set the stage on kind of what no-till is, some of the promises of it, especially from the organic perspective, and then again, some of what I would kind of craft as like the harsh realities of implementing these systems from a grower perspective. Okay, so just a real quick background. Again, no-till has been around for some time, and it really is practiced very largely globally. Just as to put it into context, right? This is about 14.7% of global cropland as part of no-till or conservation agriculture worldwide. But relative to organic is only 5.3%. So really, it's a much more well-adopted system than even, I think, organic agriculture. The benefits of no-till in terms of improving a lot of the soil physical properties are really well studied, and I think very apparent and true. We don't need to go through all of these pieces again. Most folks can, I think, have a sense of, I think, why you would want to not till the soil, what the potential that it has. On the conventional side of things, they have shown that there is kind of accumulated net returns from no-till production. And really, this is accomplished through, over time, really decreasing your inputs and decreasing your tractor expenses. Even though there sometimes are yield decreases in these systems, the net profit ends up being better over time. One of the main reasons these are so exciting is really because of, I think, how much they can reduce carbon emissions on farm. So really up to 80% of those on farm carbon emissions can be decreased in these no-till systems. And again, this idea of kind of carbon sequestration. So the idea that, our carbon stocks, where we have access to these things in in the soil versus in the plant versus the atmosphere, there's a huge pool in the soil that has the potential to sequester carbon. Now, I want to get really clear. I think a lot of that excitement around the potential to sequester carbon in no-till systems was based on some research early on that really looked at, again, kind of a meta-analysis of a lot of soil studies in no-till. The problem is that most of those studies actually just looked at the soil qualities up to 6 inches deep. And over here, on the left-hand of the side, you see the corn root system, which again goes down many, many feet into the soil. And on the right side, a 2-scale indices of the soil sampling depth of all these studies that was done in the initial work. And so while I think there's still the potential to sequester carbon in no-till systems, when you're looking at these conventional systems, again, the long-term studies on this show that you can still see a net decrease in soil organic carbon in no-till systems that are managed conventionally relative to, again, a baseline or a steady state. You do see, again, an increase compared to a moldboard plow treatment, but still a net decrease in carbon. So what the studies are showing, and what this kind of the graph on the right is showing, is that while you see an increase in soil carbon at the soil surface in kind of those first 6 inches, you'll actually see a decrease in soil carbon below that because you're not adding in those organic materials with tillage. And so you see a redistribution of soil carbon, which again, a lot of early studies said the potential for increased soil carbon was because of that increase in those top 6 inches. But indeed, we're just seeing a redistribution and sometimes a net loss in no-till systems. Again, right, we know that no-till has been an issue, right, since the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. So why didn't we see so much increase in uptake of conservation agriculture or no-till during this time? Again, this was it's from Time Magazine. This was the hottest farming argument since the tractor first challenged the horse, talking about to plow or not to plow. And the answer to that is really the creation of these fast acting, low residence time herbicides. So when these were developed in the post World War II era, that really allowed for the adoption of no-till because it allowed for better weed control without the traditional cultivation techniques. So now when you see a lot of the research and all the interesting cover crops that's coming out of no-till systems, there's also a significant amount of research that's looking at what are the actual herbicides that you use to burn down those cover crops, right? And that's what allows a lot of these no-till growers on a conventional side to do no-till production with diverse crop mixes because they can terminate it at any time with herbicides. So one of the major issues that no-till growers are seeing with this is actually this preponderance of super weeds or the herbicide resistance weeds as more spraying is happening, again, in a conventional setting. We see Europe really lagging far behind no-till uptake relative to other countries. And again, that's just because of their increased focus on, I think, the issues with pesticides. And again, just really wanting to emphasize, like, there are very big differences between the commodity crops that most of this no-till work is being done on, corn and soy on the left, versus our fresh vegetable systems here in California. So looking at some of the potential of no-till and why I think I stay committed to it, even in the face of, I think, a lot of the challenges, are that when you look at organic no-till, there's not really sufficient long-term studies to see whether the overlay of organic and no-till systems has the potential to sequester carbon in the way that I think we would hope it would. And I want to point a little bit to some of the evolving soil science around this, which is that before we used to think about if you put something in the soil that's harder to break down, like wood chips or like straw, the idea is that the harder it is to break down, the more likely that is to contribute to soil organic matter or soil organic carbon accumulation. The reality is that there's an emerging scientific view which really looks at it's not those big particles that you put in that increase the amount of carbon in your soil. It's really actually the smallest particles, the the microbes, the dead microbial bodies, as they kind of cycle back and forth and get absorbed to different soil particles, that actually leads to a really long-term soil organic carbon and soil organic matter accumulation. So in this changing understanding of the scientific landscape, right, when they look at what are the management practices that really support that dynamic stability, they're looking at things that we've known for many years are really important in organic systems: cover cropping, high C inputs, organic amendments, and reduced tillage. So when we think about the potential of systems to actually sequester carbon, some of the long-term studies that have been shown, right, the only systems that actually sequester carbon across the soil profile, so this little bar here, are really the organic systems that pair cover cropping with compost. And this happens to be in a tillage system, not even in a no-till system, but we see that accumulation at depth. So that speaks to why I think the potential of organic no-till and why it's so interesting to stay engaged in it. That said, there are incredible challenges to organic no-till systems. One being just how do you establish the how do you even establish, right, your cover crop, laying it down as a mulch? How do you plant your cash crop into that? What are some issues with cash crop yields? And these are really significant issues for folks that are working in organic no-till. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. One of the main issues with organic no-till is that it's just our access to nitrogen, because so much of in a conventional system, right, they can apply anhydrous ammonium, which is basically nitrogen in its almost plant available form. For us as organic growers, we always have to apply fertility that is microbially mediated, that's then determined by environmental factors. And so when we don't add tillage, we don't add oxygen and warmth, we don't stimulate that microbial breakdown that allows for our nitrogen. I'm going to skip through some of this just to get to some of the review points. So a quick review of overall, when you look at the organic no-till literature, and this is really, again, on corn and soy, the most success that folks have had is really in organic no-till and soy. that while they still fall behind tilled systems, because reduced costs of production actually make the system more profitable, that can work. It really only works in soy because of the potential of the soy to fix nitrogen. But when you look at corn yields, corn really has not met economically viable thresholds in organic systems because of the delayed planting times. And again, some of these issues are been around nitrogen mineralization. Both of these systems, in whatever success they've had, it's really important to note that these are all annual no-till systems. Most of these happen in the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic regions. They all do fall tillage to establish healthy cover crop stands because of how important that stand is to the overall production system. So this is not even true no-till in the kind of purest sense of the word. Where they've looked at grain systems and water limited environments in the Northern Great Plains, you see these yield reductions of 50 to 75%. When you look at specifically organic no-till vegetables, you see a really similar, even a more, I think, alarming trend in the literature, which again, a lot of this work is relatively recent, in the last 10 years. And what we see is early on in organic no-till trials, these really incredible yield reductions and inconsistency. So, tomatoes, an 89% yield reduction, zucchini, 77% yield reduction, bell peppers, 92. So basically think like total crop failure. When you look at that over the years, that has continued. Sometimes cucurbits can match, but oftentimes some of these studies show up to a 97% yield reduction. Brassicas, same thing, and then limited data on some of these other crops. So again, takeaways from the literature is really there's total catastrophic loss in these systems. And I think there's a real need for basic agronomic experimentation with how do we even implement organic no-till. One thing that I say repeatedly in this is that oftentimes with these trials, you need to be very careful about understanding how they're measuring their yield thresholds, because they might compare a no-till system with a tilled system and show that there's a yield equivalency when their tilled system isn't actually matching commercially viable yields in the region. So you could show that a no-till system could be on par with a tilled system, but if your tilled system still is not performing at what is a commercially viable threshold, you still need to rethink that system. I think there's the potential that there's crop specifics. There are certain crops that would be better for no-till practices than others, ones that have these really extensive root systems and architecture, like tomatoes and broccoli. Plasticulture is something I'll hit on later, which is something we're really looking at as a potential step forward. And that sometimes these really exceedingly high levels of fertility, so 3 times the standard practice, are sometimes what we're needed to get to a yield equivalency. So again, getting back to that issue of nitrogen mineralization. So again, California, totally different context for this than a lot of the other studies. And again, when you look at where California is ranked in terms of no-till acreage, it's right in terms of percent no-till, it's 49th out of 50. And again, we're just so different. So I'm going to breeze through that. Really quickly, the trial that we ran at UC Santa Cruz, we did a winter white mustard cover crop. We then did 3 different tillage treatments, a no-till, shallow till, and full till. That was then planted into romaine lettuce. You see the no-till trial in the front, the no-till plot in the front. Again, on a small plot, this was replicated 4 times. So we then went into buckwheat. From buckwheat, we went into broccoli. And from broccoli, we went back into the white mustard. So we ran that for 3 years. Again, 4 repetitions in a randomized design for our statistical analysis. And what we really found from this is that one of the biggest challenges was, again, this issue of agronomic basics. So just trying to get the equipment to actually plant these crops was a real challenge and led to some issues early on. So again, I wasn't able to buy a no-till transplanter that fit with our system because we don't really have those in California. So I had to work with equipment suppliers in the Midwest and do custom fabrication on our transplanting sled to make it work for no-till. So this is what it looks like when we kind of, put on our no-till coulters and chisels. And that led to some real issues with how do we actually get these plants in the ground. So you can see, right, the soil was too wet, then it was too dry, and then on the right, we kind of got that just right. One of the other, in terms of what our results were, is that the yields were, again, kind of total catastrophic losses, like 95% of our tillage treatments. No real difference between full till and shallow till. Our full till was a spader. Our shallow till was basically a small tandem disc run at about 4.5 inches, and then a follow-up pass with the rototiller. no yield differences. And again, if you look at the county average, this is a little tricky because this is organic average with leaf lettuce, not romaine lettuce, which is why I think some of our yields look excessively high on the full till. But our tilled treatments were definitely at averages or above, but our no-till treatments were really, again, 50 to 90% of that yield. Same thing in broccoli. Again, we had some issues early on as we were kind of getting the system down, but while we saw an increase in the no-till production, we really still saw, again, a very significant yield declines across the crops. When we looked at available nitrogen in terms of the inorganic nitrogen kind of across the trial, yes, there were certain times when we saw spikes in the tilled treatments, but it really didn't match. There wasn't significant differences across how much nitrogen was available to these crops throughout their cropping cycle to really warrant what we saw as really significant, I mean, just observational yield color characteristic differences, right? So here at 31 days, you can see the no-till lettuce, right? Not a lot of weed pressure there, but still significantly decreased in terms of size and vigor. We saw that again across the cover crops, so buckwheat in the same way. And then the last piece that I'll just hit on is, gophers were a huge issue for us. This is survival. So basically, what percentage of our lettuce actually survived in the plot? And we saw a really increasing trend downward. So this idea that you're not tilling and you're not working up the kind of gopher pathways, and they basically had these established highways where they could just pull these plants down very quickly. So thinking about kind of where our research is taking us in terms of other questions, these are some slides from Tom Willey, who's on the call here, that are research results from Phil Foster ranches. So Phil was experimenting with the idea of mowing down cover crop and then putting it tarping it with plastic and planting right into that. And over a number of years, saw some pretty significant results in terms of how that plastic culture worked in the no-till system to, again, either match and sometimes exceed yields in the tilled sections. So Phil ran his own kind of replicated trials of this with tilled versus not tilled, plastic and not plastic, and again, an overhead shot of this. But in the end, you see that the difference of this, like no-till, no plastic, really saw significant yield declines. The no-till plastic really matched some of the tilled no plastic and could potentially compete with the tilled with plastic. But I think I just wanted to, there's a thought right now that is swirling and something we may try at the UCSC farm this year of thinking about using plastic culture in a no-till system to really prime that system for a number of seasons before trying to implement something that is a little bit more that's more classic no-till, I think, without plastic, which so many of us, again, would want to get away from a sustainability perspective. The other thing that I'll say in terms of like research directions that we're taking is that we realize, especially from kind of a grower perspective, we really need to understand these tools, understand moisture, understand residue. And this is that focus on basic agronomic challenges. Like, how do we just get the plants in the ground? What are the tools that we use? How do we manage water in these systems? I think there's a lot of interest for us in thinking about the matching of suitability of cover crops and specific cash crops. Right, you may be able to use a white mustard that kills very easily with a short season lettuce, but that type of white mustard wouldn't work for a longer season tomato or broccoli that needs more residue cover for weed suppression. And then I think this last one, some long-term studies really assessing the potential of organic no-till to improve the soil physical and chemical properties. And this looks like, again, we're kind of pulling from some of the work in the success in hand scale no-till systems, where some of these producers have seemed to be very, very productive and are applying these really high levels of compost. So some folks in the Midwest are applying upwards of 70 to 120 tons of compost per acre in these hand scale systems. And so we're going to look at that at UCSC to say, when we just do cover crops and really high rates of compost, what do we see in terms of the soil physical properties? And is that another way that we may need to prime this system before trying to get adequate yields? Okay, I think I went through it quickly enough. Hopefully I stayed close to on time, probably not as close as I needed to, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Darryl. So much information there. Um, I think I'm going to go ahead and share quickly, and then we'll open it into more of a dialogue. So give me just a second, everybody. Can you all see this? Great. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Cole. Thank you for the introduction earlier, Aparna. I work with the Berkeley Agroecology Lab, and this is my 8th season growing. And so I'm still a baby farmer, still a beginning farmer. So um, I'm still learning a lot. And I also wanted to introduce myself briefly by sharing about my family and my lineages and my roots. I come from from a long line of settlers in Turtle Island, and I carry those lineages with a lot of humility, and with a lot of care towards healing and towards justice and towards liberation. My family was involved in citrus growing in Santa Barbara and Riverside, in the 1800s. And this is one of the brands that my great grandfather used. Um, yeah, with its sort of use of these colonial ideals and the enslavement and the subjugation of indigenous people. And this is my great grandfather here, Harley Johnston. And um, on the other side of my family was in Riverside growing citrus, and there's an indigenous boarding school, a Native American boarding school there called the Sherman Institute, where indigenous people were brought from their homes and their cultures, and um, their languages and their cultures were stripped from them, and the men were taught how to work in agriculture, and the women were taught domestic work. And I share this, you might be wondering, why is this person sharing about this in a talk about tillage? But I think I share this because um, for us to really be with the soil and with the land and with the earth, and in order to bring about the changes that we're looking for, we also have to grapple with the soil that is ourselves, right? Where are we coming from? What soil are we growing in? And I wanted to share a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from. Yes, I've been farming for 8 years, but and doing this work, but I also come from a complex lineage that intersects with land, with agriculture, with oppression. And we really need to transform these systems if we're going to actually move towards a more healed and liberated and vibrant food system. So I share that in the spirit of the possibility of something really transforming in a deeper way than just to till or not to till, if that makes sense. So I'm also paying homage to all of the incredible farmers who I've learned from and been able to collaborate with over all these years. And these are just a few. Some of these folks you may recognize. I worked with maybe 30 to 40 small farmers who are practicing no-till at the hand scale across California. And you probably know a lot of these folks. Maybe they're in your community. Maybe they're yeah, and I'll say that most of these folks are growing on what we might consider marginal land, right? Urban land, hilly areas, rocky areas, small plots. This is broadly a technique that's being employed by people with minimal access to capital, minimal access to machinery, and so are employing this technique to create highly productive soil ecosystems and farming systems where they are, minimizing the amount of machinery and capital and land that they need to have access to. And so that's a really important context for this system that I have been working with and in. And so for the last 7 years, we've been running a long-term trial comparing sort of like a more conventional tillage agricultural system with a long-term no-till vegetable production. This is all organic. And we also had a comparison between sort of a cover crop and a kind of continuous vegetable production throughout the whole year. And so that was replicated randomly and factorially across the site. You can see here, this is like our broccoli cash crop over the winter, and this was our predominantly daikon radish that season cover crop. So more of the daikon, and this is what it looks like when we had, you know, our no-till and our tilled plots actually right next to each other. Here on the right, you can see our no-till plots growing some collard greens there, and then right next to it, that was like just right after we ripped and disked and formed those beds. I think I just have more pictures. We were similar to what Darryl was saying. We were modeling ourselves after folks that are using high levels of compost. So we were applying at about a rate of about 56 tons an acre. If you're working on a smaller scale, that came out to about 50 gallons per square 100. Oh dear. Let's just go with this one. 56 tons per acre. I can get you the other one for the smaller people if you want that. And again, this is like an illustration of what it looked like where we had this cover crop that was about to come down. And then we were ongoing working in our no-till continuous production as that was happening. Again, just some pictures of that. I wanted to just illustrate like what termination of the cover crop looked like for us. So again, we were all at the hand scale for our no-till beds. And so we actually chopped by hand. We had scythes. And originally we were going to use a weed whacker, but the students, or some kind of like mower, but the students that I was working with, they were like, no, let's do it by hand. So we used scythes and we chopped. So you can imagine how labor intensive that was. Anyway, we were going for it. But then in later years, we also did use like mowers yeah. So I can talk more about that if people are interested. But basically what we would do would we would mow it effectively or chop it very finely, and then we would cover it with a tarp and cover it with compost, cover it with a tarp, and then it would decompose. So again, getting to this sort of plasticulture, we were using tarping and occultation as one of our main methods of transitioning beds after cover crop. And then after crops, we would just cut things at the soil surface, do a bit of light hand cultivation, and plant right in. So that's kind of what this was showing, right? We terminated the crop, light cultivation, planted, and that was how we would transition between cropping cycles. What time are we at? Yeah, I just wanted to invite this idea of thresholds. I found that this idea is really useful to me when I think about any of these systems and any of the results that we had. I found that we crossed a series of thresholds where change sort of happened non-linearly, and we reached this sort of critical point at which we had to kind of move beyond a sort of threshold, at which point then the system could enter a new state that actually functioned in a new way. And that's not just ecologically or agriculturally, but also sort of socially and culturally, we crossed a series of thresholds in this project. I'm just going to give some really quick results of what happened in the soil and with our project. One huge change with this system was that we saw a really big transition in the pore architecture of the soil. So this was in the first year of our study. We saw that this is pore size distribution. So these are the pore sizes from the smallest to the largest, smallest on the left and largest on the right. And after about 2 years of implementation, we saw this fragmentation where our no-till system saw this increase in micropores and a decrease in macropores. And the opposite was true in the tillage systems. We saw this really large increase in macropores. And broadly, that had the effect of increasing soil moisture, even at depth of 50 centimeters. And we did some drought stress tests over years and found really great results in our no-till system. So I would say that one of the benefits that we found from this hand scale no-till system was water retention, improved water retention, and improved sort of soil structure for maintaining soil moisture. We saw this huge divergence in soil properties and soil fungal communities, which is just illustrated by these colors. So the orange, but when we split out these properties by system, we found that they differentiated quite strongly by soil properties. And we saw, Darryl talked a lot about carbon, and there's complexity in all of this, but we did see quite large carbon increases. We tried to keep our carbon inputs roughly the same in both systems, even though some with these compost applications. And that was challenging to do, and I'm happy to talk about the complications there. But with that said, we had about 100% increase in carbon at the surface and 25% increase in carbon at depth. And you can also see the blue is our no-till. We saw increases in mineral associated carbon and particulate carbon. So mineral associated, especially interesting, because as Darryl was saying, that's what might be more persistent in the soil. We saw these major changes in the fungal communities. This is in particular mycorrhizal fungal partners. And all I'll say here is that there's a really interesting story here around ecological thresholds. We saw the sort of collapse of the fungal community in certain systems and a really enrichment in mycorrhizal fungi in others. There wasn't just like a clear better or worse, improvement or not kind of a story, but actually a much more dynamic and complex ecological story here that I think is most importantly just to say that there were these key thresholds that were sort of passed where with just, for example, between our these two blue portions of the graph here, the only difference here is what our winter crop was, whether we planted a cover crop here or whether we continued to plant our cash crop. And we saw this huge change in the fungal community just from that one practice, right? And so these systems can be incredibly sensitive, and we can cross over into new domains of ecological functioning quite quickly with a small change in practice. And just to talk a little bit about yield, because Darryl focused on that too. These particular measurements were actually done on beans. That was our focal crop for this particular part of the study in 2019. We have other data, but I just focused on this, and we found this red line is the kind of county averages for beans, and so we found a yield equivalency for this system, which is roughly between our no-till and our till, a slight, like moderate, but not statistically significant increase in the tilled system. But I'd say that we were sort of on par with county averages there, found yield equivalency. But again, this was a system where we were using a lot of compost. We were using hand methods. We were sort of, I could talk more about our practice, but we also weren't just cutting off cold turkey, right? We weren't just like full throttle on the let's put a transplant into like that. What you all were transplanting into, Darryl, looked pretty challenging. I would say we were a little more generous with our transplants, sometimes using a broad fork, right? So I think in the hand scale, there's more, because there's less mechanization, it's more of a principle of minimizing disturbance, minimizing tillage rather than no tillage. So that's maybe some nuance we could get into. I felt like we were more practicing a principle than practicing an absolute sort of yes or no, black and white, were we tilling, were we not? We were more employing the principle of let's minimize our disturbance as much as possible. And I think that was consistent with the community of practice that we were embedded within, right? So hard to compare. These are a little bit apples and oranges, but do show some of the kind of like possible paths forward.